Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for another benchmark video. For this one, we're winding the clock all the way back to 2015. Well, sort of. By that I mean we'll be benchmarking NVIDIA's 2015 flagship part, the GeForce GTX 980 Ti, but we'll be doing so with games released in 2017. Pretty crazy. With the recent arrival of games such as Project Cars 2, Total War Warhammer 2, Destiny 2, Wolfenstein 2, Star Wars Battlefront 2, that's a lot of second installments. Anyway, with all those games, plus quite a few more, you guys have been asking me to retest the GTX 980 Ti. I guess the reason why you guys have been asking for a retest is because you want to know if it's still going strong, or has it just rolled over and Keplered itself. Since I recently tested the Fury X along with the GTX 1070 Ti and all of these titles, I thought, why not add the GTX 980 Ti as well? On hand for testing, I only have the reference model GTX 980 Ti, but that's probably okay, as the Fury X exclusively used AMD's reference design and didn't come factory overclocked. That said, I'm not going to waste time overclocking the Fury X because I know it to be a terrible overclocker. Previously, when testing a massive range of games, we saw at most maybe a 5% boost from overclocking the Fury X. Meanwhile, the GTX 980 Ti saw gains of up to 30% when overclocked. By default, the 980 Ti runs at a base clock of 1 GHz with a maximum boost clock of 1.2 GHz and a memory speed of 1.75 GHz. Overclocked though, I was able to push the core up to a base speed of 1.25 GHz, which resulted in a boost clock speed of at least 1.48 GHz. The GDDR5 memory also reached 2 GHz for a transfer rate of 8 gigabits per second, so that's a 25% overclock for the cores and a 14% boost for the memory. So, stock and overclocked, how does the GTX 980 Ti get on in today's games? Let's go find out, shall we? The only thing demonetized faster than a YouTube video these days is the loot box in Star Wars Battlefront 2. Though, like a YouTube video, after a quick review process, it will likely be reinstated. Dodgy in-game currency nonsense aside, Battlefront 2 looks pretty incredible, so you might expect it to be extremely demanding. That said though, like the previous version, it's very well optimized, and here we see the old GeForce GTX 980 Ti spitting out over 60 FPS at all times using the ultra quality preset at 1440p. An average of 73 FPS placed it ahead of the Fury X, but 5 FPS behind the GTX 1070. Of course, overclocking the GTX 980 Ti unleashes a great deal of previously untapped performance, and now we're able to beat a factory overclocked GTX 1070 to match Vega 56 as well as a stock GTX 1070 Ti. That's a seriously impressive result, and it means that the overclocked 980 Ti was just 8% slower than an overclocked GTX 1080 and 11% slower than Vega 64. Next up, we have Assassin's Creed Origins, a game that sits on the complete opposite end of the optimized spectrum to that of Battlefront 2. Even though this game is horrible in terms of optimization, the GeForce GTX 980 Ti does worse than expected, it has to be said, at least in relation to the GTX 1070. That said, overclocked, it's not a great deal slower, and it was able to close in on Vega 56. I guess the key thing to note here is the fact that the 980 Ti was 32% faster than the Fury X before any overclocking even took place. Since I last benchmarked a heap of GPUs in Destiny 2, NVIDIA has released a new driver offering incredible gains in this title, anywhere from 30 to a 45% boost in performance for the GeForce 10 series GPUs. That said, these optimizations have clearly been applied to the Maxwell series as well. Here we can see the stock GTX 980 Ti almost matching the GTX 1070, a very impressive result indeed. Then once overclock performance was improved by a further 20%, now we're seeing Vega 64 liquid type performance from NVIDIA's 2015 flagship part. Impressive stuff, and it meant that the GTX 980 Ti was now just 9% slower than the GTX 1080. An overclocked 1080 nonetheless. This is a truly impressive result for the 980 Ti, and it also meant that it was almost 50% faster than the Fury X. Overclocking the GTX 980 Ti from the stock reference spec led to a massive gain in F1 2017. The jump from 75 FPS on average to 98 FPS is a whopping 31% increase. The GTX 980 Ti already had the Fury X beat by a convincing margin, but once overclocked it was on a completely different level, and it's now faster than Vega 56 and able to match the GTX 1070 Ti. Moreover, it was just 13% slower than an overclocked GTX 1080. Here we have another game where, again, at the stock clock speeds, the GTX 980 Ti doesn't look that impressive and really struggles in Project Cars 2, only matching a GTX 1060. Once overclocked, it catches up to Vega 56, though it still trails the GTX 1070 by a small margin. This is one of the worst results we've seen for the old GTX 980 Ti, and even so, it's still very impressive considering its age. Moving on, we have Quake Champions, and while not the most demanding title to be released in 2017, you do want high frame rates for optimal gameplay, and this is what the GTX 980 Ti delivers. While the Fury X drops down to around 80 FPS, the GTX 980 Ti is good for over 90 FPS at all times, and once overclocked, never dipped below 110 FPS. In fact, overclocked, it not only beats the stock GTX 1070 Ti, but it also matched Vega 64, and that's not the first time we've seen that. So again, another very impressive result. Moving on, we have Middle-earth Shadow of War, and the Maxwell-based GTX 980 Ti struggled in this title. Out of the box, it was quite a bit slower than the GTX 1070, at least when comparing the average frame rate, and this meant it also trailed the Fury X. Overclocked, it just edges ahead of the Fury X, and it isn't much slower than the GTX 1070 Ti, so overall not a bad result once overclocked. Total War Warhammer 2 is extremely demanding at 1440p using the ultra quality preset. For testing, I've used the battle benchmark and manually recorded performance of the DirectX 12 API. Stock, the 980 Ti sits between the Fury X and GTX 1070. Once overclocked though, it is able to match Vega 56 and the GTX 1070 Ti. So once again, the 980 Ti proves itself to be extremely capable even in today's games. Wrapping up the testing, we have Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, and I'm wondering if the GTX 980 Ti is lacking a bit of driver optimization for this one, as it is quite a bit slow in the GTX 1070, and as a result can only match the RX 580, though this is a Vulkan-based title and it is preferred by AMD hardware. Anyway, once overclocked, the GTX 980 Ti gets back in the game and now can be found alongside the GTX 1070 Ti, so overall, not a bad result. So, has the GeForce GTX 980 Ti Keplered itself? Nah, not by the looks of it. It's clearly still a very capable graphics card, and this is why many that bought it back in 2015 haven't bothered upgrading to a GTX 1070 or even a 1080, and the recent arrival of the 1070 Ti certainly won't tempt them either. It has to be said that so far the GTX 980 Ti looks to be aging considerably better than the Fury X, and that's probably down to the fact that it has a bit more VRAM to play with. If you're willing to tone down a few settings, then the Fury X could probably be brought back into play, so it's probably not as bad as it looks in some of the tests shown here, if you're willing to relax a few of the more memory-hungry quality settings. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. If you liked the video, please click the like button and leave me a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on the video and, of course, the GTX 980 Ti. I'm your host, Steve. See you again soon, guys.